most dangerous fighter is the guy who's intelligent and motivated. If he's trained and unleashed, he's the most dangerous man. Right man in the right job is the most devastating weapon.
Hi, I'm Kylie, just another Army vet. Welcome to another reaction video. So by popular demand, I'm finally reacting to the Beer Biceps podcast, Real War Stories from Jungles to Mountains with Major Abhay Sapru, the Ranveer Show, episode 244. And because of the length of the video, I will be breaking it up into about 3 parts. Let's get to it.
Abhay Sapru, sir, another Special Forces themed episode. Honored to have you, but I also feel at the same time that this is going to be a slightly different Special Forces themed episode. How are you, sir?
Thank you very much. Very happy to be on your show.
Okay.
I hope it's interesting.
Yeah, I feel there's so many experiences you've had, which we're going to unpack over the course of this podcast and hopefully the next one as well. There's just something different about Special Forces officers. In my eyes, as a civilian, or rather as a podcaster who's done a few Special Forces themed episodes, usually Special Forces officers are not necessarily looking for growth as the human chase. They're looking for exploration as the human chase. And I feel every human has that human chase, while most of the world looks for growth of some form, spiritual growth or intellectual growth or material growth. Special Forces veterans look for exploration of life. Is that a fair observation?
So, Ranveer, I can easily say that when people volunteer for the Special Forces, at that stage, I'm certain 100% wanted to treat it as a profession and not as a career. And there's a huge difference here. It was a profession of arms. It was not a career. When you use the word career, then you do a lot of things to further that so that you can go up the ladder. All of us were there because we wanted to be there, not because we wanted to become generals or brigadiers, but because we wanted to do things that Special Forces was offering,
Which is
going out, doing unorthodox soldiering, a tough life, the camaraderie, training, the experiences. So if you went to a SF unit, you would find, and this goes for the men also, but officers certainly, it was a motley collection of adventurers, romantics, eccentrics, misfits, all sorts. And you'll find.
I've noticed this as well. The eccentric.
I'm sure. I'm
nature.
telling you outside. I mean, you should be on the Special Forces Selection Committee. You know them backwards now.
No.
And you can see there, each of them is a character.
Each of them is a character.
Each of them is a character.
Which is what excites me about Special Forces podcasts, because usually we get molds of people. With you guys, each person is a mold.
Each guy is a character. And they appreciated it. They encouraged it. But certainly I'd say, if you want to use the word exploration, yeah, they had diverse interests. They wanted to push the limits. They wanted to discover themselves. And they were certainly different.
Yeah.
Certainly different. You know, I can't say because I have no data on it, but I'm sure if you saw some of the guys who left the army and got into CV Street, I'm certain 90% to 95% have done exceedingly well in CV Street.
What is that for listeners, just to give them context?
This is, I mean, you know, left the army and went into the civilian life.
So to help soldiers and service members actually transition from military to civilian life, before you leave the military, you're required to actually take this transition class. Such topics include getting a job, going to school, VA benefits, and resume building. And these courses are good and they're very helpful. However, some service members still have a real hard time making that transition.
I mean, it just shows the adaptability, which was one of the qualities required. You know, like the Chinese say, a good bamboo bends with the wind. Most of them have done well. I've got friends, you know, a couple of them who started companies, sold them off. They're millionaires.
These are Special Forces.
SF guys, my batch.
That's
Large
nice.
companies.
When did you serve, sir?
Oh, I'm an old soldier now. I was commissioned 88 actually.
You know, you're one of the rare Special Forces veterans where I'm not intimidated at the start. Like,
I'm
I
glad
don't
to hear
know.
that.
Yeah, what you spoke about everyone being unique, you're not like the other folks I've met. I love each of them in a different way, honestly. Like, already love you. Like,
No, but Ranveer, the point is, this is the little joke I had with my ex-NDA friends in the unit. Bulk of the officer were ex-NDAs. I'm a direct entry. I'm a Delhi University man. And I joined for a specific purpose because I wanted to prove a point to my father, who's also ex-army. So the moment I joined in the academy, and there was this grind that they were putting you into, get you into that format of what a soldier needs to do, think, behave. In the back of my mind, I used to keep telling myself, I'm a civilian. Someday I'm going to be a civilian. I'm here for the adventure. I'm here for the romance. I'm here to prove a point to my father. Keep that Delhi University side alive. And I think the moment I left, that civilian side has sort of emerged. So perhaps I don't come across that much of a soldier. And of course, the SF also gave you a chance to keep long hair, keep a beard, unconventional soldiering.
Yeah.
And discipline was more internal than imposed from outside.
United States Special Operations is the same way, especially if you're deployed. You will see the Green Berets running around in beards. Same thing with the Navy SEALs.
Unconventional soldiering for unconventional missions.
Absolutely.
For someone who's probably tuning into a Special Forces podcast for the first time, would you like to shed some light on what unconventional missions even means?
Ranveer, it could be anything. So there was a whole set of conventional missions that you trained for. i.e., and I'm talking in those days, we had 3 units when I joined. There were 3 commando units. Now you call them Special Forces, and now there's a whole bunch of them. They converted the parachute battalions also.
I'll give you the civilian version of it. Correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, Army, Navy, Air Force have their commando units, which are slightly higher efficiency soldiers and trained with supplemental training courses.
Air Force Garud, Army Para SF, and Navy Marcos.
That constitutes the basics of Special Forces. Para SF for Army, Marcos for Navy, Garuda for Air Force. And I believe now there are even more Special Forces regiments like the NSG, but I will let you go on from here. Sir.
Yeah, so the tasking, the conventional tasking is different. The conventional tasking could be anything which is behind enemy lines in a conventional war. It could be hitting a enemy headquarters. It could be blowing up a dam. It could be blowing up an aqueduct, train, raid, assassination, whatever. And this is in a conventional war. In an unconventional war, which is where we've been engaged most of the time, bulk of the experience the SF units have gained has been in Kashmir, Northeast. I had the opportunity, of course, of going to Sri Lanka. But bulk of the experience now is in counterinsurgency in your own country. So there is a conventional role, and in the unconventional, within the ambit of what is happening within the country, SF units are thrown. And those missions are ambush, raid, some of those things.
So I believe there's actually a law in the United States that prevents the U.S. military from actually conducting real missions in the United States, with the exception of the National Guard, of course.
Of Kashmir, the Northeast, and Sri Lanka, which one? I mean, I don't even know how you can gauge this, but is it a fair question to you if I ask you which one was the most challenging?
Well, of course it is, sir. I mean, you can Sri Lanka.
Really?
Oh, sir. And I can say it with complete confidence. If you ask this with any of those who served in Sri Lanka and had the experience of serving in the Northeast and in J&K. And I served in J&K for a very long time. It broke my back, 3.5 years. They will still tell you it's Sri Lanka. For the simple reason, you went to a country where you didn't know the terrain. You didn't have the weaponry. You were fighting against a bunch of people, guerrilla warfare, who could mix around with the civilians. It was a very difficult place. Your mindset, you were not tuned, you were not trained.
So I understand why the Indian Army operates in J&K as well as the Northeast, I guess, but why were they operating in Sri Lanka?
And every infantry battalion that went in suffered casualties, very heavy casualties. My own unit, which is an SF unit, lost 3 officers killed, 5 captains wounded, 32 other ranks. When I joined, senior majors were going into operation, and everybody lost people. They shattered the myth of the martial races, the Gorkhas, the Sikhs, you name it. They would maul you.
So the two countries actually at war, and is this still going on today, or when was this?
They were killers. See, the most dangerous fighter is the guy who's intelligent and motivated. And if he's trained and unleashed on a terrain of his own choosing, he's the most dangerous man. And as the American Special Forces say, the right man in the right job is the most devastating weapon. And the Tamil Tiger was exactly that.
When you use this word motivated in terms of combat, what does that do to a human's mind? If you say that, okay, my mind is motivated within combat, does that make you do riskier maneuvers, more dangerous moves? Like, what is it?
Ranveer, if you're not motivated, you are going to hold yourself back in combat. Simple. And in Sri Lanka, everybody was raising this issue at some stage or the other. What are we doing here?
What are the Indian?
Why are we here? And there was this big talk that the RAW is supporting them. I hit a camp, and this is a known fact. I hit a camp where there were receipts of their casualties being treated in some clinic in Rameshwaram. There were movie tickets. They had their safe houses in South India. The RAW was supporting them. Everybody knew this double game happening. And at the same stage, you were getting mauled. So there were what you call radio patrols happening. The things that you see in the Vietnam.
What is
the
the
very you sent a patrol. The patrol go out 200 meters from the perimeter, sit in the bush, fake some radio messages, come back. Why take a chance? So it pushed the army to do these things because it was such a dangerous place. You stepped out of the post, and you didn't know you would come back in one piece. And I personally, I have the concentration of a butterfly. Very poor concentration and focus. Sri Lanka is the only place where I still remember when you stepped out of the post till you reached the ambush site, all your senses were working. All your senses were working. You couldn't let your guard down. They would hit you.
So could you give some geopolitical / political background on the situation? I'm assuming that this is about 93, 94, roughly that time. What was happening with this whole Tamil Tiger situation, and why were people even riled up in the first place? Because we have a lot of Gen Z listeners who were born after 2005.
No, they don't know a thing.
Yeah.
They don't know a thing. My second book was on Sri Lanka.
I'm Generation X, but I should get a pass considering I'm an American.
From about early 80s, the Sinhala and the Tamils had been at loggerheads.
Who are the Tamil Tigers?
The Tamil was always treated as a second-class citizen. Now, in a nutshell, there are Tamils who went in the last 100 years who were taken by the Brits for rubber plantations. There were Tamils who had been there from the Chola times. They were the old Tamils. Nevertheless, they were treated as second-class citizens, and there had been resistance from time to time. And at some stage, a whole bunch of these Tamil parties came up: EPRLF, LTT, Plot, etc., etc. Prabhakaran was the head of LTT, and he was the most aggressive, pugnacious by nature. And at that stage, a whole bunch of these people, under pressure of the sort of genocide being committed by the Sri Lankan forces, were coming into Tamil Nadu. And there was a fear in Tamil Nadu that there could be a voice to carve out a separate Elam, including parts of Tamil Nadu and stuff like that. So, and Tamil Nadu is a big state, and therefore it was decided at some stage that the Indians have to intervene. And instead of directly intervening, they decided to train the Tamils, arm the Tamils. And a whole bunch of them turned up for training in camps spread across Tamil Nadu. And one of them was at a place called Chakrata. This is up in the hills next to Dehradun.
Really, that far up?
Yes, and this is the interesting part, and I say this in my book also. The interesting part is my father was posted there, and that was his last posting
In Chakrata.
in Chakrata. If I can
Sure.
digress a little more, now Chakrata has a base. It's called Establishment 22. It was set up in after the 62 war, funded by the CIA to train Tibetan guerrillas. These are people who had migrated, crossed the border, and come into India. Mostly comes from eastern Tibet. So they
What
were
is
to be
that?
trained.
Like
Kham-
a
it's
tribe?
a Kham. It's
Okay.
a Khampas, so the eastern Tibet area, fighters basically. So it was decided that the Americans would fund the Indian army, would train them, and they would be sent back for sabotage, spying, etc., back into Tibet. So it was a very hush. It still is a very secretive place. They haven't developed Chakrata. It's at 7,000 feet. It's a nice hill station, but it's still a single road, and it's not by design. It's not by default. It's by design that the government doesn't allow anything to come up. And from time to time, that school, which was training Tibetans, was used for training all sorts of unsavory characters in the subcontinent. Sindhis, Baluchis, whoever needed to be trained could be sent there, one corner tucked up in the hills. And then at some stage, they started sending the Tamils. And the senior leadership of the LTT were trained there.
But who were the trainers?
Indian Army officers.
So this is an official.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, I was about to join the army, and I'd come back from college, and my father was posted there. And I recall every weekend, because we were settling down in Dehradun, it's a 2-hour run. So every week, the school, Tutu establishment, the institute, would send the bus down to buy provisions at Dehradun, which was the nearest town. So my father would come across every weekend to stay the weekend. And I remember sitting there, and this bus drives up, curtains pulled, the driver wearing civilian clothes, but you can see the mark of a soldier on him. And my father steps out, and behind him, there's a South Indian guy carrying his suitcase. And this happened a couple of weekends. And I asked him, I said, who's this South Indian? He touched my father's feet. And I said, what is this? Oh, he said, some canteen contractor, just grateful. And then he retired, he settled down, and, I got into the army at some stage. And then the India Today came out with some articles about the LTT and the problem in Sri Lanka, and they being trained in Chakrata, and there was a picture of Prabhakaran standing there with his cronies, the background of the hills. And my brother was also there. My brother looked at it and said, I've seen this guy. He's pointing at Prabhakaran. So I said, are you sure? Because they're writing about this guy now. He said, I'm certain. Now, my brother claims that Prabhakaran came there to the house. I don't know, but I certainly saw a whole bunch of these, and, in 88, 87, you didn't see too many South Indians in Dehradun up north. And you could see distinctly that they were different. So now look at this. The father trains them without realizing that the son will be facing his former students at some stage. And when I came back from Sri Lanka, I remember he was a very seasoned soldier. I came back from Sri Lanka, and I remember the first evening, he didn't ask me anything. In the evening, we sat down over a drink. And then he looked at me and he says, so, what do you think of the boys? I said, which boys? He said, my boys. I said, well, they were good. We lost a lot of men and officers. And I think I saw a little smile and a twinkle in the old colonel's eyes as he looked up. And then he raised a salute to the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka. He said, serves you bastards right. Bullying with the boys, aren't you? He was very impressed with them. He says, some of them didn't even know how to tie a shoelace. And when we worked out an 8-hour training program, they said, no, the senior leader came up and said, no, make it 13, make it 14. That's the kind of motivation they had. And then you unleash them, train them, arm them, and unleash them on their own terrain. They were deadly.
Now I understand what you meant by motivated.
So that's one part. No, the other part is that, after they went back, and they took on the Sri Lankan army. And then at some stage, Jayawardene and Rajiv Gandhi signed this accord. It was supposed to be between 3 people, Prabhakaran, Jayawardene, and Mr. Gandhi. Prabhakaran was holed up in Ashoka Hotel, I think, sort of a house arrest, guest. He was not consulted. They went and signed up. And I was told, fait accompli, here is the accord. He said, I have not even consulted, and I'm talking about an ELAM, an independent state. I'm not interested in all this nonsense. I said, we don't care. We're sending the Indian peacekeeping force to ensure, because President Jayawardene said, look, we can't enforce disarming. We don't have the manpower. So we got embroiled. A whole bunch of us turned up there thinking it's going to be a peacekeeping mission. The Sri Lankan army was sent back into their barracks. We took over their post.
Which year was this?
It is 87. I joined later, of course, but the unit had been committed for some time. All 3 commando units were there. And till then, the LTT used to come sit in the mess and stuff like that, chat around. They'd been trained. Some of the instructors had trained them from the SF. All one army there.
What do you mean they came and sat in the mess?
Because we weren't taking them on. You see, for some time, the Indian Army, Maratha Battalion and a SF unit sitting at Palali Airfield. We're just sitting and watching what is happening while the accord was being signed. What sparked it off was that they captured 17 of these senior leaders, LTT leaders, the Coast Guard. And at that stage, the accord had been signed. So Jayawardene said, hand them over to us, the Sri Lankan army. The LTT said, don't do it. They'll be tortured, they'll be killed. But because the accord had been signed, it was decided to hand them over to the Sri Lankan army. At that stage, they asked that a last meal be given to the boys, and they passed cyanide capsules inside. And all 17 of them committed suicide, chewed on their cyanide capsules.
To prevent themselves from
Oh,
being
yes, from being
Because they
taken over by
definitely-
the Sri Lankan army. And that was the spark. After that, the next, I think it was a 10-para, without taking any names here, it was one of their ration trucks which was going to Jaffna.
I would not blame anyone for doing that. After all, people are capable of some horrendous and brutal things. So I don't judge those soldiers or those people that took those cyanide capsules. Not at all.
Got the boys out, burned them, put tires around their neck. And then it was free for all. The enemy was Sri Lanka and the LTT then.
They attacked Indian Special Forces.
And the infantry unit there. And then the force started building in. Because by then it was all right, if you're not going to listen to us and disarm, and your intent is clear, you're hostile, then we're going in. So then they started building in troop movement. And then they realized they needed more troops and more troops.
So can someone clarify? His father trained these people to actually fight against the Sri Lankan government, I guess. And by the time he got there as a soldier, he essentially was actually fighting the same people that his father actually trained. Is that right? Because in all honesty, that kind of reminds me of the U.S. Army or military training the Afghanis against the Soviets. And then before you knew it, the Afghanis were actually using our weapons and our tactics against us in Afghanistan.
And once we'd taken over the urban centers, the LTT promptly disappeared into the jungle. Then it became jungle fighting. So most of my experience in Sri Lanka is just sitting in bloody ambush.
You mean in a jungle?
In a jungle. It was terrible. 72 hours, 96 hours, no bloody water. You're just sitting there. Some track coming in, going out in a very thick jungle. And you would go in at night, sit there, and just sit there.
So you guys would just wait for 72 hours continuously in the jungle and observe if there's any kind of movement or any kind of disturbance? And
It was an ambush.
Okay.
It was an ambush operation.
For someone who doesn't understand that word, how do you explain?
Well,
The simplified version of what an ambush is a sneak attack.
you conceal yourself on some intelligence or at random because you feel there's movement, hostile movement, on a track.
On a track.
Track.
You mean like a road in the jungle?
Well, yes. And then you hope that the guy comes along so you can hit him.
And there's the danger of wild animals.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I ran into a few.
Really?
Yeah. I remember there was a Jat battalion and an elephant picked up the last guy and carried him in the bloody jungle.
And killed him?
No, threw him down. He was a little shaken, but he survived. I laid an ambush, I remember, and I think it was a 72-hour ambush. And the LMG guy suddenly nudged me. I was right next to him. We were covering a track. He nudged me and then did this. And in that starlight, through the foliage, couldn't make out what he's showing. And then I saw some movement. I'd see that. I could see the foresight of the LMG, and I'd see something rise and fall and rise and fall. And then it was a wild boar. The guy was, I don't know, maybe he was bloody drunk on some fruit or something. He just walked up, sat himself, leaned against the LMG barrel, went off to sleep.
Wild boars are actually very fierce. I've heard of some soldiers getting treed by boars in Germany and also in Georgia where I was stationed. But yeah, do not mess with wild boars.
And here the 20 hard SF men, shitting bricks. If this guy wakes up, and he's a Tusker, he wakes up and he charges. That's the end of your ambush, and that's the end. What do you do with a Tusker sitting there? And then he got up, shook himself, disappeared. And I felt very happy. I said, if this guy doesn't know we're sitting here, that means, because it takes time for the jungle smell to start coming.
What is that?
So you go, people often land up in ambushes. You can't go wearing aftershave, hair oil, talcum powder, and nonsense of that kind. So it takes some time before, generally 24 to 36 hours, before you start smelling like the jungle, which is essential. Because, people who you are after, the opposition is only living wild. Their sense of smell is very keen.
So for some reason, the last part of his story just kind of reminded me of that scene in Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio, how he was explaining to Dimon Hinsu, or whatever his name is, about when he was in Africa, he was able to track people by their feces even. Scent is a big thing, especially when it comes to actually tracking people, so you don't want to be wearing things like perfume or baby powder or cologne. Definitely not. Anyway, thanks for watching. Once part 2 is up, I'll put it right here. If you do want to help support the channel, I could really use a like, a sub, a share, or thanks.